Hi there, bell ringers. Welcome to the Bell Ringer Interview with an Expert. I'm education journalist Holly Corby. And if you're new here, the Bell Ringer is a Substack newsletter that is the only journalistic outlet currently focused only on research concerning teaching and learning. And today, I'm wearing my son's video gaming headset. I hope you like it. This is what I had available. And today, I'm also very excited to talk with fellow journalist and education writer Natalie Wexler. You may know her from her work at The Atlantic or The New York Times, or her wildly popular evidence-based books like The Writing Revolution or The Knowledge Gap. She also has a Substack called Minding the Gap that I read and share on the regular because it's consistently about evidence-based reading instruction. So today, though, we're going to talk about her new book, Beyond the Science of Reading, Connecting Literacy Instruction to the Science of Learning. And I think that you're really going to enjoy this interview. It's coming out January 21st. And hopefully what I'm hoping we can do today is make some connections between the research on reading and the research on all of learning. So hi, Natalie, and welcome.
Hi, Holly. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much. You know, when I started reading your book, the first thing I thought about is that in my everyday conversations, when I bring up the words science of learning, it is confusing to a lot of people, even in the education world. So do you mean the science of reading, or that must have to do with reading and not with math? And we're in this moment where when we talk about evidence on teaching and learning, it's almost like it's a bunch of separate things that is separated by subject content. But your new book asks readers to look at things in a different way, that the science of reading connects to and is actually a part of this larger body of evidence on how humans learn generally. So, my first thought is, what were you seeing or observing or thinking about that even made you wonder, hey, how are these two things connected?
Yeah. Well, I've had for the last several years a foot in sort of two worlds, one foot in the science of reading world, one foot in the science of learning world, or, cognitive science. And, I've gone to conferences like Research Ed, which are designed to bring principles of cognitive science to teachers who often don't learn about those things during their training or even after. And so, there's several reasons I wrote this book, but one reason was that I think the research ed movement, the science of learning movement is terrific, but there seemed to be this sort of blind spot. They weren't talking about literacy instruction, except insofar as it relates to phonics and decoding, and you got to get that automaticity with phonics, and so that you have the cognitive capacity to do things like understand what you're reading. Fine. But nobody was really talking about the way schools have been teaching reading comprehension and whether that lines up with cognitive science, or about writing. I don't, never see anything about writing. And well, lately there's been some, but not really examined through the lens of cognitive science. I mean, most of the studies we have from cognitive scientists focus on math or science or some substantive content area. And one thing I realized is, if you are a literacy teacher, a reading teacher, and you want to apply the principles that are backed by cognitive science to your instruction, you really can't, because those principles, they assume that you're either teaching actual substance like history or science, or that you're teaching a transferable skill like decoding words. But when you're teaching comprehension skills, you're actually trying to teach non-transferable skills, which is kind of what my book, The Knowledge Gap, is all about. But something like making inferences. I mean, yes, kids do need to learn how to make inferences when they read, but it's taught as though it was this sort of abstract skill that you can teach directly and then kids will apply generally. So if they practice making inferences on some very simple text, that they'll master the skill of making inferences and they'll be able to make inferences about more complex text. But no, actually, I think it's kind of common sense. If you're reading a book on a topic that you know really well, it's a lot easier to make inferences than if you're reading a complex text on some subject you don't know anything about. So something like retrieval practice, which is very powerful, it's this principle that if you practice retrieving an item of information that you've got somewhere in long-term memory, but, maybe you've slightly forgotten it, the more you practice retrieving that item of information, the more likely you are to be able to retrieve it in the future. And that sort of lays the foundation for higher order thinking, analysis, et cetera, and learning more about that topic. But if you're teaching making inferences, what do you have kids practice retrieving? It doesn't make sense to just retrieval, making inferences. I mean, like, what is that? And then if you've got 25 kids reading, books on 25 different topics, you're not trying to teach any common content. So you can't have them practice retrieving any common content. So that's one reason I wrote the book, is that I want both teachers of reading and people in the cognitive science of learning movement to understand that there's this kind of disconnect. And so even if you discover principles like retrieval practice as an elementary teacher, you're spending maybe, the half your time, instructional time, or maybe a third, let's say, teaching stuff that you cannot apply these principles to. So that's one thing. Maybe I'll pause there.
Yeah, pause there. I mean, because you're really, what you talk about early on in the book is kind of that within the science of reading, that phonics instruction has kind of sucked up all the air out of the room as far as evidence-based practices are concerned. But that's really only a piece of making a fluent reader, and teaching reading comprehension. I mean, one thing that I was thinking about as I was reading is it is not a very straightforward thing to teach at all. So these cognitive science principles are you say they can help with reading comprehension and writing, but you have to look at it in a different way.
Absolutely. And I do think we need to get away from the idea of teaching reading comprehension as something that's separate from teaching content, because, I mean, it's a little complicated, but because I think there are different reading comprehension skills that maybe require different approaches. But basically, one of the messages I hope that people will take from this book is that all of this stuff is connected, and that every literacy teacher should also be a content area teacher, and vice versa. Every content area teacher should also be thinking, I mean, if you're teaching science, if you're teaching history, you should be thinking about, what vocabulary do these kids need to know, and maybe what to retain, so we should focus on that. What about this reading passage or this chapter, what kind of support do they need? And writing, every subject, can benefit from writing, because that is another message I'd like to get across, is that writing is probably our best way of teaching a lot of the things that we try to teach through teaching reading comprehension strategies, like finding the main idea, which is pretty much the same as summarizing. And rather than just saying to kids, and I've seen this, and I've heard from teachers, this is often the way finding the main idea or summarizing is taught. You just tell kids, well, just focus on the important things and leave out the unimportant things. But many kids need more guidance than that. And so through writing, you can provide that kind of structure, that kind of guidance. But also writing, and I really would love there to be more research on writing done through a cognitive science lens. But we do have studies that are cognitive science studies showing that writing can be a very powerful form of retrieval practice. I mean, the sort of iconic study involving college students reading about sea otters. they were, it's called the testing effect, sometimes retrieval practice, but they were not taking a quiz. I mean, testing can be a great way of engaging in retrieval practice, but those students were being asked to read a text and then write about it right afterwards. And that's what helped put that information into long-term memory and make it possible for them to access it. And also writing involves elaboration, which has been found to really help with comprehension. But these studies are not labeled writing studies. So, I don't think that people who are teaching writing draw on them. There are some studies within the education sort of sphere that are called right to learn studies. And they show that when kids write about, not just ELA, but in content and they're learning in history and science and math, whatever, that on average, it does help them retain that information. It helps them, boosts their learning. But those studies show kind of a moderate effect as compared to the retrieval practice studies. And also, on quite a few of them, maybe almost a fifth of them, show a negative effect from having kids write about what they are learning. And I would argue that the problem here is writing is really hard. And those studies, it's kind of hard to say what is causing these negative effects where kids are writing and actually learning less. But we also know from cognitive science that writing imposes this incredibly heavy cognitive load, especially if you're an inexperienced writer. So maybe what's happening in these studies, we do have some interesting evidence that this is true, is that kids are being asked to write who are inexperienced writers, and they're cognitively, and they're maybe just being asked to write without any particular support. So they're so cognitively overwhelmed by the task of writing that they don't get those knowledge reinforcing, knowledge deepening benefits from writing. So my message, actually, to boil this down, to, cognitive scientists, please do some research on writing.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
for teachers, I would say, if you have a content-rich curriculum, it may not provide all of the support that all of your kids need, especially in writing, but also maybe in just, being explicit enough generally. If you combine a content-rich curriculum with an explicit approach to writing instruction, you can avail yourself of all of the benefits of cognitive science and more, probably, because when you teach kids to construct complex sentences, use complex syntax of the kind that they're going to see when they read complex text, like subordinating conjunctions, etc., if you teach them to use that kind of syntax in their own writing, they're going to be in a much better position to understand that syntax when they encounter it in their reading.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just making me think of, I think, Robert Pondiccio, a friend and fellow education writer, has said that writers know stuff. And and as two writers sitting here, how easy it is to get cognitively overloaded by trying to write something. And B, that you really can't write about it fluently until you really know the material well, and you know the ins and outs. So that is a connection. I have a question about that a little later on, and I want to go into that a little bit more. But your point about teachers is making me think, and you mentioned something I said in your book, like around chapter 3, that U.S. teachers at this moment not only do they not know about this connection you're talking about, they don't know a lot of the general cognitive science principles, cognitive load theory and working memory and retrieval practice, even if they have learned the science of reading, even if they have been trained in letters, they still don't know about those things. So when you were doing research for the book, did you find university programs that are kind of blending the two together, or including cognitive science on memory or practice with the science of reading principles?
Well, I did find some, usually not, though, in like literacy or like elementary literacy classes. I did, years ago, I wrote a piece that was published in the American Scholar where I really focused on what Deans for Impact is doing and it's an organization that, is trying to, among other things, get teacher training, teacher prep programs to embrace principles of cognitive science. It's very slow because you don't just tell college professors what to do. And so, and also, to avoid pushback, it's better to have this grow kind of organically. And I think in a few places that may be happening, but I will say that this was, again, I was years ago because I was doing this for the magazine piece I was writing, and I kind of drew on that for the book and updated some of the research. But I sat in on some literacy methods classes that were being done at one of the, I'm not naming it in the book or now, but one of the institutions that had signed up to infuse cognitive science principles, through their teacher prep program, but it was going slowly. And the literacy methods classes that I sat in on showed no evidence of that cognitive science bent. In fact, they were saying things that really contradicted what cognitive science would say. I mean, one professor, for example, who had told me when I talked to her ahead of time before I sat in on the class, and this was virtual because it was during COVID, which was kind of an advantage, so I didn't have to fly across the country to sit in these classrooms. But she said, yeah, oh yes, kids need knowledge. I'm a total believer in knowledge. But when I sat in on her class, all she talked about was strategies. Before reading strategies, during reading strategies, after reading strategies. And she even said at one point, you don't want to worry about kids remembering things like names and dates. They can always Google that stuff. And the other thing I noticed, and I think this is probably true in literacy training, was that one course I sat in on was about supposed to be content area literacy, like social studies. But the focus was all on pick a text. First of all, choose a standard, like a social studies standard, and they can be either encyclopedic or random or, and then choose a text to teach the standard. And that was about it. And so, like, one text would be the way you would teach a standard that said, for example, fifth graders will learn about all of the major events of the 20th century, including World War I, the Depression, World War II.
Right.
And there was no focus on, should the teacher have knowledge of this? And should you be trying to build kids' knowledge of this, the content here? In fact, there was one book that was being just discussed as a possible, you could use this book on waves to teach about sound waves, ocean waves, all sorts of waves. And one of the students in the class, one of the prospective teachers said, it says here that every wave is different. And I wonder how they know that. And the instructor said, yeah, I wonder how they know that. Well, anyway, let's move on. I mean, it's just
right. Okay. Well, so this is my next question, and you have brought it up beautifully, is that teachers if you want to connect the science of learning principles and the science of reading principles, and teaching comprehension is actually really tricky. Someone has to tell teachers how to do this. There has to be actual explicit instruction for them on how to take this knowledge and how to put it into your reading instruction. So I kind of want to start with like the big picture, like the top level. Science of learning cognitive science principles help boost reading comprehension. How do they do that?
Well, I mean, first of all, as I said, I think we need to get away from like the idea that we're teaching reading comprehension as separate from content. But so cognitive science principles apply to any learning, right? And so it's not that you're learning about comprehension. It is, you're learning to comprehend whatever the content is. It could be a novel. It could be a historical topic. It could be a science principle. But if kids are reading and then you ask them to write about what they're reading, and I mean, it's not just writing. So you want to have discussions grounded in the content. You want to have kids, first of all, you want to make sure that you have their attention. And so I don't go into that a lot in the book because other people have talked a lot about that. But, you need to have an orderly environment that's got a certain level of order and calm so kids can actually focus on whatever it is you're trying to teach. But then you need to have some substance that you're teaching. And I think reading aloud is a great way to develop both content knowledge and literacy abilities, because we know that basically before kids are proficient readers, before on average age 13, but whenever you become a proficient reader, it is going to be easier to take in information, complex information through listening than through your own reading. Listening comprehension exceeds reading comprehension through about age 13, because you've got an experienced reader doing the work for you of decoding the words, figuring out how they're pronounced, where to put the emphasis in a sentence. I mean, the reader needs to be reading with appropriate expression, etc. But then once you've got that, the vocabulary, you've heard that, you've been exposed to those concepts, and it's important to talk about it. All of these things are connected. So listening, speaking, reading, and writing, they're all aspects of literacy, which, you see that written, but they haven't been connected in most literacy classrooms. So what happens in most literacy classrooms is obviously there is content. If you're reading a book, there is content, but the focus is going to be on something like maybe determining the author's purpose. That's the reason that the teacher is reading this book aloud. Right. And then the discussion is going to focus on what's the author's purpose rather than hey, what happened in this book? Let's try using.
Well, you say something that the more you have stored in your long-term memory, the better reader you are. So when you're teaching this content, your aim as a reading teacher is trying to get some of this information into students' long-term memory, right?
Yeah. I mean, and not just that. That's sort of the foundation for then, asking them to think about it and do all of these things, make inferences, find the main idea, whatever is appropriate to that content. So it's a question of what gets put in the foreground. It's not, here's the skill we're working on this week, and here's a text I've chosen because it lends itself demonstrating or modeling the skill, and then you go off, and this is the next thing that happens, is the kids go off to practice the skill, comparing and contrasting, whatever, on books on totally, random topics, because they'll be limited to reading at their individual reading level. And that's a whole other can of worms, because the tests used to determine their reading levels are very unreliable.
Yeah.
But they'll be directed to a basket of books organized not by topic, but by reading level, which means things like the length of the sentences or how frequently used the words are. So they may be trying to practice the skill of making inferences or comparing and contrast on a book about some topic they know nothing about. I mean, they may have listened to a text on sea mammals, but they choose a book and it's on the solar system. And so it's going to be, we're just making reading much harder than it needs to be, because we know that, if you're reading about a topic that you don't have background knowledge on, that imposes a heavy cognitive load. If you're still struggling with decoding, that imposes a heavy cognitive load. At least let them read books that they know something about, and they not just that they've happened to pick up outside of school, because that's kind of what we've been doing. Oh, you know about trucks? Maybe you'd like to read this book about. Well, yeah, choice is nice, it's important, but you're not very unlikely to choose to read about a topic you know anything about. Once you introduce kids to a new topic in an engaging way, they're likely to want to read more about that topic. And I've heard this over and over again from teachers. And so then there's writing. I just want to, don't want to sound like a broken record, but we also have been asking kids to write about things that are not connected to the actual content of the curriculum, maybe personal experience or personal opinion, or maybe prompts about or separate writing curriculum, but really topics that they may not know very much about. And if it's hard to read about a topic you don't know much about, just try, Holly, I know you'll understand this.
Yes.
Just try writing about a topic you don't know anything about. You really cannot do that. So connecting these aspects of literacy, having students read and write about topics they have acquired knowledge of through first listening to read-alouds and whole class discussions, that's going to help kids read and write at a higher level. And I think that is what cognitive load theory points to.
Well, you give this really great example, and I think it's in like chapter 4 about, like the kids are learning about Henry VIII, right? And you give this really great example of how retrieval practice concerning the facts of the history of Henry VIII, concentrating on the content, using retrieval practice to get the kids to remember some of this content, that's going to show up later in deepening their class discussion, deepening their written work. These outcomes that we want to see in kids by doing some things like retrieval practice, getting some of that knowledge into long-term memory, is actually going to help them with these analytical skills, these things we so badly want them to be able to do with what they're reading.
Right. And I think, that's a general problem throughout education, is that there's been this idea that, well, let's just, we don't have to waste time on those lower order things like just literal comprehension, right? We just want to, let's go to the analysis and the synthesis. But the whole point of that pyramid, Bloom's taxonomy, is you can't analyze stuff that you don't understand. So you cannot skip those lower level stages. They're crucial.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I see it so much like in my own, I've seen it in my kids' education, like what you're saying about like, you can't write about something you don't fully understand, that you don't have some knowledge to draw on. It's impossible. Yeah. And so it makes your writing weaker, and it makes a lot of sense.
Right. And these are true. I mean, it's true of all of these skills, really. I mean, critical thinking. It's not just these reading comprehension skills. You cannot think critically about a topic you don't know anything about. And I think we have assumed, I've only taught highly motivated adults, but, I've taught things like English as a second language and writing. But, you assume that people get a point, because nobody, people don't like to raise their hand and say, I don't understand what you're talking about, or they may think you do understand. And you can just assume that students know things that they actually don't. So it's really important to test out, did they get what I thought they get? And a great way to do that is through writing activities. Mm-hmm. Essentially sentence level, well-constructed sentence level writing activities can really uncover misconceptions, misunderstandings before it's too late. And, I mean, even just really basic things, like I know in a book I was reading about teaching history, a history teacher had been teaching about the American Revolution at the high school level for a week or two, or whatever. And finally, one kid raised his hand and said, "Wait a minute, we're fighting against the British?" So, like,
Exactly. Exactly. That describes kids perfectly. Yeah, you've got to make it super, super clear. So one thing I want to pivot just momentarily because you talk a little bit about the science of learning advocates and that they sometimes don't acknowledge that the stuff like retrieval practice and and working memory doesn't is connected to reading comprehension and writing construction, and that it doesn't often work in a typical classroom approach to reading comprehension. And so why is that? Where is that misunderstanding coming from, and what's the disconnect?
I can't really be certain about this. I mean, I think it's this general thing you see in the science of reading world too, that the phonics part is just easier to understand. If you're not yourself like a reading teacher, we've been living with the controversy about phonics for 70 years
Right.
now. So it's familiar. It's kind of more straightforward. And when I try to explain what the knowledge gap is about or whatever to people who are outside the education world, they are very confused by,
Right.
because I think we all assume, well, schools are teaching, social studies and science and reading. And this whole reading comprehension skills and strategies piece of it is hard for people to wrap their minds around. And this may be true of teachers at the high school level. I mean, I don't think they often understand why their kids don't know some certain things about the world that they assume kids know and that are certainly assumed by the curriculum, like who Thomas Jefferson was or whatever.
Right.
They don't know that kids aren't not getting this stuff at lower grade levels. Some of them pick it up from their parents, their families outside of school, but a lot of them don't. And I think it's the knowledge gap has had an impact, but I think maybe it's within this sort of literacy world, elementary literacy mostly, maybe some middle school, but math teachers, social studies teachers at the high school level, it may still be unfamiliar to them, and I don't know for sure. I mean, there are some who understand it and are on board. I don't want to sort of overgeneralize here, but I just don't see much discussion of this when I go to these conferences or when I look at what's been written about in the cognitive science world.
Well, it's interesting because, in this piece I wrote for the Bell Ringer about working memory, what I found was that a lot of teachers, when I asked them about it, they were using the principle of cognitive load theory. They had never heard that term before. Mm-hmm. And so that they were absolutely doing it. They're like, oh, I didn't know that was a scientist. To me, it is common sense. So there does seem to be a need for some explicit connection making for educators.
Yeah. I mean, I think it can be useful to introduce terms like cognitive load theory, but one of the things that I drew on your work for the book was you had interviewed a pseudonymous school principal, I think, who was he had introduced cognitive science principles into his school, but he said, but we don't call it that. We just do it. And I think the fact that he wanted to remain anonymous tells you something about the state of
the whole ballgame.
Cognitive science in this. I think teachers, and I completely get this, they get a lot of things thrown at them. I don't know that they want to take on the science of reading that I'm dealing with. Now there's the science of writing, and you're telling me there's also the science of learning, that I have to absorb these principles and figure out how to apply them to my instruction. And, I think that's a lot. So I would say maybe this principle actually has a good idea. You don't just do it. And so if you're modulating cognitive load sort of instinctively, that's great. I think that sometimes teachers aren't doing that, and then they need some help in understanding that why kids can't do what they're asking them to do, or why they're struggling to do that. Maybe it's too much cognitive load, but you could just say, you're asking them to do too much. It's just overwhelming. Let's make it less difficult. But I think, that the way in for some of these, this is one reason that I focus on writing, because I think that may be more appealing to teachers than saying, we're going to teach you all about the science of learning and cognitive load theory, and
Yes.
here you go. I think a lot of teachers know that writing is a pain point, that their students are struggling to write. They themselves probably haven't gotten good training in teaching writing. They could use some help. And if you, as I said before, if you, and basically I'm referring to the method, the writing revolution method here, which is not the only good method out there, but it is the one that I'm most familiar with. And I think it works really well. And it's very explicit. And if you say, hey, helped you with your writing instruction, but you got to have content that you're actually teaching.
Right.
It's not going to work unless there's content.
Right.
Put these things together. And I saw this happening in a district I visited when I was doing research for the book, that they wanted to basically fix their writing problem, but it ended up fixing a lot of other problems too. The kids are actually, their oral language is better, their reading comprehension is better, and they're learning more.
That's really interesting. I mean, it makes me think a lot about, I did a story for the 74 on Frederick County, Maryland, and they're kind of taking this approach, that they're kind of saying, teachers, here, they pick kind of a theme every year. They've been working on it for over 10 years, picking, an evidence-based theme, showing it to teachers and saying, hey, just try this. Or if you're already doing it, just make this adjustment and see what happens. And it has been quite successful in that teachers do try it, and it's not a mandate, and it's not, a top-down decision. And so teachers say, hey, thank you. I'm already an expert in what I do. You've given me some new tools, and they are finding some success in it. And, one thing that Meg Lee said to me about the science of learning was that they had tried basically everything to try to bring equity and to shrink gaps between students, and that this had been by far the most successful. So can you talk a little bit about instructional equity and how you see it through this lens?
Yeah, I mean, that is what got me into writing about education in the first place was, there's this thing that we used to call the achievement gap, but we don't really use that term much anymore, but it is still there. It's basically a gap in test scores and other outcomes. And I would say it's really between kids at the upper and lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. But what really works for kids, for all kids, but especially for kids who are struggling to learn in our current system, is more explicit instruction. And that doesn't mean just lecturing. Of course, it's interactive, but explicit instruction using these principles of cognitive science, retrieval practice, distributed practice, etc. There's lots of evidence out there that the kids who benefit the most from that kind of instruction are the ones who are struggling the most in our system. I mean, whether they're coming from it's really not about, poverty per se, as much as having less highly educated parents, so that you don't have as much opportunity to pick up the kind of knowledge and vocabulary outside of school. And you really rely on school for that. And we also have a couple of intriguing studies that are sort of counterintuitive that suggest that all learners, if they're getting good instruction, especially if it's backed by the principles of cognitive science, learn at essentially the same rate and in the same way. And what explains a lot of the difference in where they end up is the difference in their prior knowledge. Mm-hmm. So the good news there is that we can really help level the playing field a lot by doing whatever we can to equalize. I mean, we're never going to completely equalize, but equalize as much as we can the level of knowledge that kids are bringing to a task.
Great. And so what are the obstacles? So for reading teachers and history teachers and science teachers, what are the obstacles to getting these practices to improve reading instructions? What do, school leaders and educators and teacher educators need to think about?
Well, I mean, I think, it would really be helpful if we could change teacher prep programs so that they were more receptive to some of these cognitive science principles and applying them to how do we teach reading comprehension? How do we teach writing? I think we're making some progress on the decoding side of things,
Right.
because that drum has been banged very loudly. I don't think we're making nearly as much progress on the side of how do you teach, how do you approach reading comprehension,
Right.
how do you approach writing. So teachers are going to have to be learning a lot of this on the job. And I think a huge advantage is if you can identify and implement well a knowledge building elementary curriculum. And probably the best, your best bet for doing that is to adopt a knowledge building literacy curriculum. So because it's really hard to get schools to make more time in the schedule for social studies,
Right.
for science. There's been so much emphasis on reading and math. And so these knowledge building literacy curricula are kind of a backdoor into introducing social studies topics and science topics in the literacy block, which is on average 2 hours, sometimes more. And so I would recommend that people are interested in what are these curricula, looking at the website of the Knowledge Matters campaign. They're curriculum experts. I'm on the board of the parent organization, but I don't have anything to do with them identifying knowledge building curricula. They have experts that have done that. I would say none of them are perfect. There is no such thing as a perfect curriculum, but they will really help guide teachers in what content. I mean, there's how do you decide what content to teach? Well, they'll help guide that, and they'll help ensure, if it is adopted school-wide, that when kids are acquiring knowledge in a fairly logical order, so that when they get to fourth grade, they will have acquired the knowledge assumed by the fourth grade curriculum in previous grade levels. So that helps with the content, but that not all of those curricula, I'd say most of them, do not provide enough explicit support for writing instruction. So combining those curricula with a method like the writing revolution, which I have seen happen and I know is happening in a lot of places, can really turbocharge that curriculum, can really heighten the effects of it, the benefits of it for students. So that's what I would say, the elementary level. I mean, it gets more difficult at the secondary level when you've got kids who are coming in with gaps, serious gaps in knowledge and skills. And there are things you can do, but it's at that level, definitely. And I think writing is one of the most promising ways to help kids at that level with both literacy and knowledge gaps. But you get a bigger bang for your buck if you start in kindergarten.
So this is my last question. Is there a good argument to be made that we should just abolish all these different terms? My husband, who works in marketing, he owns his own business, that he was like, ooh, you all need a rebrand really badly. Like there are two, is there like a dream scenario where we could just refer to the evidence on teaching and learning and it's all connected and we would all know what we're talking about?
I wish. I mean, I think your husband's got a good point, and I think a term like the science of reading has, become a problem in itself to some extent, because it's seen as, the definition gets simplified and isolated, and then people start attacking it because has been oversimplified, but I mean, we can't just use evidence, because there's all kinds of evidence, and some evidence is more reliable than other evidence.
Right.
There's the kind of evidence that has been, what a lot of faculty members at schools of education, the kind of research they've done is more ethnographic, more qualitative, not so quantitative. There's a place for that, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what's working. I mean, like you could say, oh, the students were really engaged and felt successful, and so this was a successful intervention or whatever, but that doesn't mean it was, because kids can feel engaged and not be learning anything. So I don't really, I don't know how to package this in a way
I don't either.
would avoid these
I
problems.
just say to all the readers and all the listeners, should I have a contest? Like, should we rebrand this? Because we, as writers, we want it to be succinct. We want it to be easy to understand, but we've got a lot of, I'm half joking, but I'm half not joking, because how we communicate this to the public has been just obsessing me this year. It's a very complex idea, and boiling it down to something simple is,
Yeah, I mean, you could look at other countries that I just saw a graph on, I don't know, Twitter or X, whatever, The OECD, there are some countries that have a much narrower gap between, students at the upper end of the socioeconomic spectrum and the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. They probably aren't like talking a lot about the science of reading and the science of learning. They are just doing it. But those countries don't have the same kind of heritage that we do, the same kind of philosophy that's been ingrained in so many teachers, so many educators in this country with the best of intentions. But that philosophy, I mean, it really tends to happen in English-speaking countries for some reason. But that philosophy has become an obstacle to really effective teaching. I mean, the irony is it could really make teachers' jobs easier if they were able to get these messages without all of this confusion.
Right.
And my hope is that enough teachers will just start doing it, as that principle you quoted mentioned,
Yeah.
and others will take note. And I think that is the best way for this to spread, is kind of organically. If we can have early adopters who are doing a good job throughout the country, and identify them. I mean, I think that is something that is very frustrating. Is there's no easy way to find. I mean, even this principal you quoted, we don't know his name even. So how are we going to find this school and see what they're doing?
Right.
So we need people to sort of come out of the closet a bit.
Absolutely. This has been terrific. Thank you so much for being here today, Natalie. Everyone go out and buy Natalie's book, Beyond the Science of Reading. It's published January 21st. And then after the book gets published and we all read it, then we'll have another series of discussions on the Bell Ringer about the ideas in this book, because it's getting me really excited. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Holly. This was terrific. Wonderful questions. Great conversation.
Thanks. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.